Last year, Frederator Studios' own Castlevania hit Netflix, treating us to all of the sweet nostalgia of the old school Castlevania games, giving us warm memories of our childhood while we watched Dracula purge the world of all humanity in one of the goriest animated shows I've ever seen next to Berserk or, I don't know, Happy Tree Friends. And it is awesome! The biggest criticism I and a lot of other people had with the series was that our time with Trevor Belmont was way too short. And when the most common complaint aimed towards a show is that there wasn't enough of it, that's not bad, especially not for a video game adaptation. Thankfully, we're getting our wish. Just in time for Halloween, Season 2 of Castlevania is going to be hitting Netflix tomorrow on October 26th. And with Halloween in less than a week riding off of last week's coattails, we're going to be continuing the festivities by looking at this unapologetically brutal and gothic-inspired show, befitting of the season. Okay, holy shit, go back. Did he just whip that dude's finger off? All right, I had other ideas, but we're doing this one now because I can't let this go. I know Castlevania is big on whips, but just how strong is Trevor's whip here? I'm Jacob with Channel Frederator, and this week let's take a look at Castlevania and see if we can figure out the true power of the Belmont Arsenal. For those of you who haven't gotten around to watching Castlevania yet, like, go do that. The first season's only like an hour and a half. You'll be all caught up for season 2 in the same amount of time it takes you to watch 4 episodes of The Office that you've already seen 15 times. If you're unfamiliar, Castlevania is an adaptation of the late 80s, early 90s game Castlevania 3: Dracula's Curse, a prequel to the original game which follows Trevor Belmont, ancestor of new Smash Bros. Contender Simon Belmont. Being an adaptation, there are slight differences, but the show keeps that Castlevania spirit alive, as Trevor allies himself with Sypha, a scholar who can harness magic, and Dracula's son, Alucard, to storm the castle and... You know, I'm starting to think the Belmonts aren't very good at this. However, being a Belmont, this means that Trevor's arsenal is very familiar to those who have played Castlevania games before. You know, swords, throwing knives, I think he throws an axe at some point in the first season. But most importantly, a giant monster-hunting bullwhip, which is a staple of the series. In the show, Trevor says that his whip is consecrated, that is to say, essentially been made sacred for the specific purpose of fighting vampires and demons. Which makes sense, being a member of a notorious vampire-hunting family and all. But it's this scene I want to focus on, wherein Trevor confronts 2 corrupt human priests in an alleyway. Trevor successfully severs one of the priest's fingers with just one crack of his whip. And his whip doesn't have like a blade at the end of it or anything. Or not yet, at least. Now, you could definitely say that the priests in this scene were certainly acting like demons, assaulting an elderly speaker for no other reason than to find a scapegoat for all the demon attacks unleashed by Dracula. Hardly the actions of honorable men. After all, what is a man?
A miserable little pile of secrets!
But you know, physically they're humans that have just been led astray by the corruption of the church. At least I'm pretty sure they are. So if they're just humans, when I first saw this scene, I immediately had to know, is it actually possible to sever a finger with a bullwhip? Is this something that's even comparable to our own lives, or is this just part of the fantasy of Castlevania? You might remember this from when you were a kid in the schoolyard, but there's a popular urban myth that humans are actually easily capable of biting our own fingers off, comparing it to the amount of force needed to bite through a carrot. But since our brain knows that this isn't the best decision for our well-being, it subconsciously stops us from being able to follow through. And this idea has been ingrained into the public consciousness over time. I'm sure that, like me, a bunch of you have heard this rumor before, and hopefully, unlike me, didn't try it just now. Hey, don't do it. In any case, a lot of us have gone through our lives believing our fingers to be relatively weak when compared to the rest of our body, which would make for some good severing. And if Castlevania is to be believed, they would be the most likely body part to be severed by the crack of a whip, but is it actually possible? Yeah, I'm not willing to submit myself to a live test here, so we're gonna have to figure this out some other way. Well, if we're gonna talk mutilation on Cartoon Conspiracy, let's do it right. Cutting off a finger is an undertaking that we would have to split into several parts, but most importantly, 2 extremes. The first is cutting through human skin, which is a surprisingly elastic organ. God, it's almost like it covers our entire body or something. Try cutting a rubber band with a butter knife. That's kind of how skin is. Thankfully, our answer to this problem is pretty simple. We're not using like a butter knife, we're using a whip. And striking your buddy with a whip can definitely result in their skin getting cut. There are pages of disgusting Google image searches to prove this point. And these kind of surface abrasions are achievable with even basic leather whips, and I think we can assume that the Belmont family would have a significantly more sophisticated whip. In the games, the Vampire Killer Whip, which was wielded by Trevor in Dracula's Curse, was originally created through alchemy, allowing it to change its form as the player progressed through the game. For example, in the game, the player can turn the standard whip into a chain whip, much like the one we see Trevor with in the trailer for Season 2. It's unclear to us if Trevor's whip whip in the series has the same power, or if Trevor just found a different chain whip. But either way, I think I can say with relative confidence that Trevor's Season 1 whip can definitely break through skin. No, the real question here is whether or not Trevor's whip can cut through bone. In this whole equation, bone is definitely the most challenging thing to get through. You know, a whip isn't a blade or a gun. The work put in is manual, and it doesn't have a very fine pressure point, which makes cutting bones pretty difficult. It probably goes without saying that old rumor about biting through your finger like a carrot isn't true. I mean, I'm no scientist, but I'm pretty sure that we eat carrots regularly, and we don't eat bones. At least I'm pretty sure most of us don't eat human bones. And if you do, I'm very afraid. But you don't have to take my word for it. A bunch of studies have been done, but many of them show that across all types of people, the maximum amount of force most of us can probably bite with is about 180 pounds of force on the low end and up to 240 pounds of force on the super high end of people, which I assume consists entirely of Jaws from the James Bond movies. These two numbers translate to about 480 newtons to just over 1,000 newtons of force. And considering those numbers are for pretty strong bites, the amount of force to bite a carrot probably ranks significantly lower on this scale, around maybe 200 newtons if we were to estimate. Meanwhile, according to a German study published in 2012, researchers experimented with the durability of bones in our hands by applying force to the bones of cadavers. And when it came to the bones in the fingers, they found that the average amount of force required for a fracture was around 1,485 newtons. Not much more than the force exerted from a super strong bite. But keep in mind, that amount of force only caused a fracture, not a clean break. For that, we're gonna have to look elsewhere. Consider the ribs. They're bones that lie under our skin without much other protection, much like the bones in our fingers. And it's been found that a sharp blow of about 3,300 newtons is enough to snap a rib about 1 out of 4 times. So based on these numbers, you probably couldn't bite cleanly through the bone of a finger. You might be able to come close, but for the love of God, don't try it. At best, your teeth are gonna hurt after you fail to bite through bone, and at worst, you're gonna be headed to the hospital with a whole lot of blood to clean up. And it will probably be both of those things, actually. But enough about self-mutilation. We're here to talk about whips. And while it is the roughest of estimates and not a one-to-one comparison, we're gonna use this number of newtons as the number that Trevor has to match in order to free that priest's finger from his oppressive hand. So, how strong is Trevor's whip? Well, whips are well known for breaking the sound barrier at 343 meters per second. The energy used travels down the whip and makes its way through, and as the mass of the whip continues to decrease, the energy remains constant, but increases in velocity since there's less mass for that energy to disperse amongst until it eventually breaks the sound barrier. And until recently, it was thought that the tip of the whip, called the cracker or popper, is what broke the sound barrier, but recently it was discovered that it happens much earlier in the process, and that the cracker travels up to 2 times the speed of sound, about 686 meters per second, or 1,534 miles per hour. Effectively, you're firing a tiny bullet at your opponent. The question now is if we're dealing with high-end ammo, or BBs, or even something weaker than that. So let's try to estimate the kinetic energy of Trevor's whip, since whips are basically a study in that sort of thing. As we discussed in our Hero Waka episode about how strong the United States of Smash really was, obligatory plug for our anime channel Getting the Robot, we know the kinetic energy is equal to half the mass of the object times the velocity squared. Keep in mind, we're going to be taking a lot of shortcuts here, but to start, let's figure out the mass. Whips are pretty lightweight, around 6 to 8 ounces, but Trevor's whip is probably a bit more heavy duty than most, so let's assume it weighs about 10 ounces in total, or 283 grams. As for velocity, this would relate to how fast Trevor himself throws the whip, which he does at a very leisurely pace. It takes about 1.2 seconds for his whip to connect over a distance of, let's eyeball the distance and say around 22 feet. This means that the initial motion would be about 12 miles per hour or 5.3 meters per second, and that's actually pretty slow, but Trevor's a laid-back guy. With these estimates plugged into our equation, we can find that the energy output of the whip crack is about 3,975 joules. And after some more math and converting of units that I'm not going to bore you with here, we come to the result of 1,465 newtons in the crack of this whip, which is in the same ballpark as what you'd need to fracture a finger. Though in fairness, if we were going to go about this properly, we also would have considered things like friction and air resistance, which would have accounted for a loss of some energy, maybe about 15 to 20% of it, which would have affected our final answer. Keep in mind that this is just the result I got, and I am by no means a scientist, so I can't 100% confirm its accuracy. If this result is true though, then that means that while it is theoretically possible to slice off a finger with a whip, then Trevor shouldn't have been able to in this circumstance since his throw was so sluggish. Though with that in mind, I do have one more idea as to why Trevor was able to so easily dismember these priests with his whip. A couple moments later in that same scene, Trevor pretty effortlessly liberates a priest's eye from his socket, which is disgusting but also thoroughly amazing. And you know what? While we may have seen that Trevor's whip shouldn't be able to cut through bones so effortlessly as we see in the show, maybe it's not Trevor's whip that's strong, maybe the priests are just weak to Trevor's consecrated whip, because they're not entirely human. Think about it, Trevor's holy whip is specifically designed to do more damage to vampires, demons, all sorts of monsters. And while certain demons explode on contact with the whip, consider Alucard, a Dhampir, a child of a vampire and human mother. Being half human, Alucard certainly doesn't explode on contact with the whip like those other demons we saw, but he doesn't exactly walk away with a simple skin abrasion either. It does significant damage to Alucard during his fight with Trevor, with single whip cracks sending him flying across the room and creating pretty deep cuts on his person. Granted, he's able to regenerate these wounds, so they weren't much of a hindrance to him, but maybe these priests aren't so lucky. They clearly get wrecked by Trevor's whip in a similar way that Alucard was. Since the priests don't seem to be able to regenerate, that rules out that they're Dhampirs, but does that rule out that they're any other sort of half-demon creatures? Maybe, but I personally love the idea of Dracula's army of demons going so far as to infiltrate the church itself, further explaining their corruption. As Dracula's armies of demons and vampires steamroll Wallachia, instead of rallying the people, the demon-infested church does nothing but assign blame to other groups, whether they're the Speakers, the Belmonts, anybody that will create discord among the humans, distracting them from forming an opposing army, making Dracula's goal all the simpler. And it's only the team of an excommunicated exile, a Speaker used as a scapegoat, and one of the beasts humanity is meant to fear that can properly expose the corruption of the church, rally humanity, and take down Dracula's forces. All speculation aside, we'll know for sure once Season 2 of Castlevania drops on Netflix tomorrow. But as for the conspiracy of Trevor's whip being able to sever human fingers, while it is a magical whip on the plausibility meter, I think I'm gonna have to rate this 3.5 Belmont family crests out of 5. Are you excited for Season 2 of Castlevania tomorrow? I'm totally in for it, but what do you think? Do you think that this show has finally ended the curse of bad video game adaptations? Let us know in the comments. Once again, I'm Jacob, Frederator loves you, have a happy Halloween, and try to stay safe out there. Don't get cursed or anything on Halloween night.